Thank you, everybody, today for joining us for the State of the Dinosauria panel. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We have Lynnea Jackson from the University of Michigan, Evan Johnson-Ransom from the University of Chicago, and Dr. Thomas Holtz from the University of Maryland. So thank you all so much for making time tonight or today, depending on where you're at, to join us. And I think we have some questions we were planning on starting with. So I think we'll probably just go ahead and ask for a brief introduction from each of you, then we'll jump right in. So Lynnea, do you want to give us just a brief background on you and your work?
Sure. I am currently a PhD student, so I'm starting my first year at the University of Michigan. I'm studying with Jeff Wilson, so I do sauropod type things. I've done a master's, so I did my master's at the University of Minnesota with Pete McAvicky. For my project, I was working on a basal sauropod from Antarctica. So for my PhD, I'm kind of continuing in that same lane. I don't know what I'm doing, so I can't tell you that yet. But yeah, basal sauropod type stuff is what I'm working on.
Excellent. Thank you. Evan, you want to give us a brief introduction, please?
Yes, of course. Hello there. My name is Evan. I am a second-year PhD student at the University of Chicago with my research focusing on the feeding function of meat-eating theropods such as Tyrannosaurus. I received my bachelor's from DePaul University under the advisement of Dr. Kinju Shimada, where I looked at fossil fish paleontology. And for my master's, I went to Oklahoma State University under the advisement of Dr. Eric Snively, where my research focuses on the evolution of feeding in Tyrannosauroids, so Tyrannosaurus and its various relatives. And for my PhD, I am currently looking at the cranial-cervical function of Archosaurs, including Spinosaurus.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, Tom.
Hi, so I'm Dr. Tom Holtz. I got my PhD back in 92. So it was a lot easier to study non-avian dinosaurs then because they were still around. No, just kidding. And I worked under John Ostrom as my advisor. My work then was on the functional anatomy of the feet of various sorts of carnivorous dinosaurs. And in that work, that's where I coined the term arctometatarsus for this pinched third metatarsal that pops up in a number of different theropod lineages. And in the decades since, I've I've worked on theropod locomotion, on theropod paleoecology, on dinosaur paleobiogeography, and on various issues, but mostly in things with theropods.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for introducing yourselves. And if you have any questions, make sure to pop those into the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on that. But to get us started off, I thought we would kind of hit one of the questions that Tom kind of posed to our group, which was what are some of the outstanding issues in the phylogeny of dinosaurs? So please discuss.
Okay, yeah. When I proposed that question, the main concerns that I had, and they're not the only ones, but the main ones are what's going on at the base of the dinosaur tree. Because for a long time, it was fairly clear that we have these three major groups. We have the sauropodomorphs, the long-necked, mostly plant eaters. We have the ornithischians, so the beaked bird-hip dinosaurs, and the theropods, the cool the carnivorous dinosaurs. And that most of the evidence pointed towards sauropodomorphs and theropods being sister taxa, each other's closest relatives. And with that sort of relationship, we had a good understanding of what it was to be a dinosaur and what anatomical traits united all of Dinosauria. And then in the last 5 years, some papers have come in that have sort of shaken things up at the root of Dinosauria. Now, one hypothesis is that ornithischians are closer to theropods than theropods are to sauropodomorphs, the ornithoscelida hypothesis. That a peak of popularity, but even its original proposers actually don't support that anymore. But what's a little more troubling insofar as it really messes up the characteristics that unite dinosaurs, is that there's some papers that suggest that the silosaurids, which for the last 20 some years appeared to be the closest relatives to the dinosaurs, are in fact early types of ornithischian dinosaurs. And therefore, many of the traits that we might look for that unite all dinosaurs, that in my teaching and writing and stuff, we would use as the characteristics of dinosaurs, like a hand with an opposable or semi-opposable finger, a large delta pectoral crest, a open hip socket, open acetabulum. Those wind up not being dinosaurian traits because they would be independently derived in sort of the classic ornithischians and the sauropodomorph theropod clade. And it might be true, silosaurids as basal ornithischians. It's not unreasonable, but it's annoying if true, because it does shake those things up. So that's just one example of a problem or a level of uncertainty in dinosaur interrelationships that's currently ongoing.
Lynnea, was that something that you encountered with some of your work on your critter from Antarctica?
Not particularly. I think I was a little more narrow focused, so that was not really an issue for me, and I would really rather stay out of it entirely.
Oh, come on. Totally don't blame you.
Yeah. So that didn't really factor into my analysis that I did for Jolly Roger. That's what my dinosaur is nicknamed, in case you have not heard of Jolly Roger. But yeah, so I haven't had much experience dealing with that. But it is interesting that this has come back up recently in a class that I was taking. So we were reanalyzing that paper, the phylogeny in that paper, and we found that it was more robust than I thought it would be, in terms of how many times it took to dissolve all those nodes.
Well, and so thinking about that, one of the questions that you had kind of posed was how, thinking more about the animals themselves, how do the vertebral air sacs arise in dinosaurs? And when we're looking at what Tom's talking about and the whole way the tree is sort of, or the bush is structured, how do you think that all ties in? I open that to any of you, the three of you.
So I had posed this question because there's been some papers that came out relatively recently. So they were talking about the origin of air sacs in the vertebrae of dinosaurs. So that's usually referred to as postcranial skeletal pneumaticity, which is way too long of a phrase. So PSP, if you hear me say PSP, that's what that is. So postcranial skeletal pneumaticity is where you have these like pockets of air that invade the bones of the spine, and it kind of helps to lighten the skeleton. And we see that in sauropods, theropods, and pterosaurs. And so this paper, I think it was 2022, it was by Aureliano et al. It noted that this trait arose independently in those three lineages. So if we mess everything up, then maybe it would not have arisen independently 3 times.
Yeah, it all ties back to how we interpret things.
And another complication with that, and I think it was Matt Weddle who's shown this, is that you could see as a like an emu or other modern bird is developing, as it's growing, it can actually have postcranial pneumaticity on one side of the vertebra and not show any on the opposite side of the vertebra. Because after all, the evolution's not actually generating holes, it's generating these pockets, these epithelia that are then eating into the bone. And so if it doesn't go into the bone, if it doesn't dissolve the bone, it could be present but not leave a real mark. And that can be just annoying. because we've got what we have to deal with are the bones, the traces of it. And so if there's something that doesn't leave a clear mark on the bone, its presence becomes difficult to ascertain.
Yeah, and that ties really nicely into something that Evan brought up, which is how do we reconstruct these internal or muscular anatomy of dinosaurs? That's something that is very popular and being worked on in a lot of different groups. So, Evan, can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so usually for my research, I kind of take a look at the jaw muscles. Now, one of the things is that I am currently looking at the cervical muscles in dinosaurs, and there's always going to be that consensus of do we go with an avian style neck musculature or do we go with a crocodilian style neck musculature? And I think the general consensus has been more like it's kind of more like a Venn diagram. Which group has similar musculature that's present in both birds and crocodilians that we can infer would have been present in dinosaurs. And if there's a difference, when do we start to say, would it have probably had a combination of the two or maybe something similar to it? It's one of those moments where we have to take a look at as many extant taxa. So we probably take a look at many birds, ducks, crocodilians, even outgroup taxa such as sauropsids, such as lizards and pharanids.
Excellent. Tom, with some of the work that you've done looking at the way animals move, and especially when thinking about trackways and things like that, how does that kind of play into some of your past work, and how have you seen that change in the last even 10 years?
Right. Yeah. So ecology is that is the study of trace fossils. It's an old part of paleontology, but it's been really undergoing a lot of updates and modifications and so forth. In part, digital data makes it much easier to get the information. So, by scanning it or photogrammetry, we could actually have a record of it that's maybe a little better than going out there with steel tape and so forth. Our ability to try to recognize what particular species or genera might have made those footprints in some cases can be useful. Now, sometimes we've got tracks from environments where we don't have good body fossils or vice versa, but sometimes we do. And so, we might be able to pin down, like, for instance, the Paluxy tracks really do seem to match the skeleton of Acrocanthosaurus, which is a contemporary dinosaur of the same size. And so perhaps it's not Acrocanthosaurus atokensis, but it's something close. And so we could use that as sort of an independent test of locomotion because, we've got the skeletons that most of us work on, and they tell us about how the body's constructed, where the muscles attach, and so forth. And that's important information. But they're the remains of dead animals, whereas footprints were made by living animals. And so they show us how it was moving as it was walking around. So the more we could sort of integrate what possible animals made what particular set of tracks, the more we can get a picture of integration of the skeletal information and the trace fossil information to see the animals as they were as when they were alive.
And I think that kind of plays into their ecology too, right? Because from the tracks, sometimes we're able to infer maybe are they moving together? Is the area covered in an area that was, was it submerged? Was it, on land? Was it dry? Was it wet? There's a lot of different things that we can start to tell about the different ecology that these animals are living in and how they're surviving and how they're operating. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh, sure. Although anyone else who wants to join in on this would be great.
Yeah,
but yeah, so there are occasions, for instance, track sites from Asia that seem to be from bipedal, from specifically dromaeosaurs, because they're two-toed feet with one raised third toe. It's actually the second toe, but so that matches the footprint of a dromaeosaur, and it's 6 of them together, all traveling in the same direction, and they are paralleling the footprints of an iguanodontian. And there had been previous thought that perhaps dromaeosaurs may have operated as pack hunters on occasion, going after larger prey. And that was based on co-occurrence of fossils and so forth, of body fossils. Now, we can't say for certain that the iguanodontian and the dromaeosaurs were there at the same moment, but they are exactly paralleling each other, and the quality of the footprints are very comparable. And that gives us sort of a narrow window of the viscosity of the sediment. Because think about this, there's only a certain amount of time as the sediment is exposed, as it's drying out, when it's going to have the same level of viscosity, so be able to record the same level of track. So it was probably within a short interval of time. So it is at least consistent. It doesn't demonstrate, but it's consistent with the possibility of pack hunting in medium to large size dromaeosaurs.
And
Yes,
Lynnea, oh, sorry, go ahead, Evan, please.
yes, and just something else to add to that, we can also take a look at the body sizes of the trackways, so we can probably tell like if there were large adults and somewhat late-stage juveniles too, so it can probably give us an idea about what types of dinosaurs were hunting what too.
And I was going to say, it can also kind of feed into posture a little bit, like Linnea's working on sauropodomorphs. And what can that kind of tell us about their posture? Because we know some of these animals can be both bipedal and quadrupedal.
Yeah, so I found two recent papers. One is really, really recent, by Lockley et al. And I thought it was so cool. It's really interesting. It's based on trackways. And then there's another one from, I think, 2022, but also about trackways. So there's two types of identifiable basal sauropodomorph trackways that are from Southern Africa. I think it was Lesotho. And there's two types. One is quadrupedal and one is bipedal. And I just think it's so interesting that we're capturing this transition between the bipedality to quadrupedality in basal sauropodomorphs, because that's like a huge stepping stone in the evolution of that lineage.
Absolutely. And we see that occurring, in several other taxa as well. And in these track sites, sometimes we can see little handprints, and sometimes all we see are their hind foot tracks. And so these are things that can again kind of help us to inform us more about what are these environments that these animals are living in. Like with the animals that Evan and Thomas happen to work on a lot with theropods, how does that kind of play into their ecology, and how does ontogeny play into that? And there's a lot of different questions that you can ask about how these animals are growing in their environment, how they're interacting with their environment. So can you all speak to that a little bit more?
Yes, of course. So one of the things that I actually reference a lot in my master's research and also in the 3D Tyrannosaur FEA study was Dr. Holtz's work along with Dr. Catherine Schroeder's research on Tyrannosaur theropod ecology, where in some Allosaurid ecologies, you have a lot of theropods of varying body sizes having their own ecological niche. So in the Jurassic, you have Allosaurus feeding on a variety of sauropods and also smaller theropods, Ceratosaurus possibly being found in a semi-aquatic environment, so probably feeding on more aquatic prey and smaller animals, and Torvosaurus probably would have been doing its own thing too. But in Tyrannosaurus, especially with Tyrannosaurus, you have a theropod that terraformed its environment to its own liking. You have an adult Tyrannosaurus as the large theropod, whereas juveniles functioning as the medium-sized predator in its environment. So it's one of those things where you have to take a look at what theropods or what predators are in certain environments and what they probably would have fed on. And also we contribute this to trace fossils too. So bite marks. We have bite marks on the bones of dinosaurs belonging to both adult and juvenile T-Rexes.
Excellent. So when we're thinking about these bite marks, I mean, when we start thinking about all the cool taphonomy stuff that we can see in specimens too, I mean, you can start to get really excited. There were some really great talks at SVP just last week about different taphonomic things that are people are studying and looking at. Lynnea, with any of your work, have you dealt with any cool taphonomic modifications that you're seeing?
The biggest taphonomic issue that I've had is that the skull I was trying to describe was crushed. But yeah, that was
A lot with those pesky sauropods.
yeah. Still salvageable, so it worked out. But yeah, if we're talking about ecology, I think the one that I was studying was from Antarctica, so it was from the same formation that Cryolophosaurus was found from. So I think that's a really cool interaction to consider. Probably not cool for my dinosaur because it would have gotten eaten.
It's always a hard part of the coin to be on, that's for sure.
Mhm.
Well, and everybody, there's always kind of like the people love the carnivores, and sometimes the poor herbivores don't get as much love.
Right.
What are some other like controversies or issues that we see that paleontology or people working in dinosaurs specifically face as they're doing their work or their research, or misconceptions that people may have?
I actually can talk about this. It's usually the helpless herbivore. It's one of those things where it's like, no, not necessarily. Theropods or any predatory animal will usually go for either the sick or young herbivorous animals. They would not want to run the risk of going after a fully grown adult healthy herbivore that can easily fight back. For example, at Montosaurus, it could grow to gigantic proportions, more so than an adult Tyrannosaurus. And sauropods, they were gigantic. And even with the early sauropodomorphs, they could actually have really powerful manual claws too, so sharp clawed hands. So there's a chance they could probably take in a very nice swipe at a Cryolophosaurus if it really wanted to.
Yeah. And I think also if you compare to like a modern environment today, like we would definitely be staying away from like a hippopotamus.
Oh,
So
absolutely. Yeah.
Yes,
And
no, absolutely.
and another thing that people need to I think do a little more with regard to the herbivorous dinosaurs is, you know, we need, and there is some, don't get me wrong, but a lot more like biomechanics and bite force studies and locomotion studies on the herbivorous ones. Because we get these bite force analyses like Evan's working on a variety of different theropods, and they're telling us something about different forms of feeding and how they're splitting up parts of the ecosystem and so forth. Well, plant eaters, they have to feed, and honest to goodness, T-Rex still is an adult T-Rex is still like the strongest bite force of a fully terrestrial animal calculated so far. And I think that is only because we haven't done the bite force calculation at the back of the jaw of Triceratops. And I think when that's finally done, that's going to blow Tyrannosaurus out of the water. And that's me saying that. Because that skull is just such a solid skull, gigantic jaw muscles, and that sort of scissor action there going on. So, yeah, I think seeing bite forces in things like ceratopsids and in hadrosaurids and so forth. And granted, they could be a little more complicated. And there's questions of the degree of motion going on in there. That's going to be a little tougher than some of the theropod studies. But it's definitely going to be worth it. So I hope to see those studies come out in the not too distant future.
I agree. I think that work it would be really great to see more done with, and we definitely have the technology and a lot of brilliant students out there looking for projects, and so I think that's something that people should definitely consider. And then when you think about the fact that all of these giant herbivores have to be eating something as well, not everything can be a semi-arid environment. When you start to look around, you have to start thinking about the plants. Are there more plants out there? What are they eating? What kind of diversity is there in the plant matter? And I think that's something that doesn't get as much attention as some of the cooler things do.
cooler.
Cooler.
This is my secret agenda. That's why I'm here in the first place, is to support herbivores.
Thank you. We need this balance in the world. Well, there you go. Tell us a little bit more about why the herbivores are just as cool as the theropods or the other carnivores, and what are some trends that you see could happen in dinosaur paleontology that diverts us a little bit into other arenas beyond theropods?
I think, sorry, Lynnea.
Sorry. This kind of is tying into what I'm trying to figure out that I want to do for my PhD. So the thing that was really interesting to me, based on what I had done for my master's, was that the teeth of the basal sauropodomorph that I was working on were really strange for a basal sauropodomorph, and I thought it was really interesting. So that's kind of getting me into looking at differences in tooth morphology within basal sauropodomorphs and more derived species. So I'm kind of trying to track down these changes and how they occurred and why things are shaped the way they are. And then that has a lot of interplay between flora and trying to match ecology with these herbivores. And so I don't know what I'm doing, but it's going to be something related to that. And so I think that opens up kind of a whole craniodental world of questions.
No, that's excellent. Evan, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, so while I have mostly focused on the hypercarnivorous theropods, it's usually the herbivorous theropods that also caught my attention. And there is one particular herbivorous theropod that I would love to do an FEA analysis on, and that's Dinosaurus, the terrible claw, or sorry, terrible hand, that's Deinonychus, which you can see the arms of which at the American Museum of Natural History, but in 2014, when they found the complete skeletons, it was just mind-boggling how bizarre that giant ornithomimosaur was. And it is really good to finally see some more depictions of it in popular media, such as the 15-minute short Hatchling. And not to mention, it would be great to do possibly some jaw muscle reconstructions for it, as well as FEA on it too, to be able to understand its ecology.
So can you tell us a little bit more, Evan, about what some of the techniques are that people are using to evaluate different dinosaur feeding strategies?
Yeah, so this was mentioned earlier, but some paleobiomechanics, they will use finite element analysis or FEA. And to do this, we will be applying the jaw muscle forces at areas of attachment sites, so we can do them on the cranium and also on the mandible. So with finite element analysis, red indicates high stress and blue indicates low stress. And with FEA, we can be able to evaluate which parts of the skull are going to be showing high stress and which ones are going to be showing low stress. For the cranium, the parts that show low stress are going to be areas of muscle attachment sites, such as the pterygoid, so this little nub right here, along with the quadrate and squamosals. But for some areas that do show low stress, it's going to be the nasals or the nose bone. So it kind of makes us wonder, are there a lot of structural biomechanics going on in this? And what can this also tell us about their internal anatomy, too?
Excellent. Yeah, I know we have a few audience members who are super curious about hearing more about FEA work. So that's something they could maybe reach out to you for more information, right? Or look up some papers from the various labs that are working on that, such as Dr. Snivey's work.
Yes, of course. And for those that do practice FEA, that's usually by Dr. Eric Snively. There's also the Casey Holliday's lab, and there's also Jack Singh's lab too, and even Colin Ross's lab as well.
Yeah, it's a really big field right now. There's a lot of cool things and so much good work and so many good papers out there taking place. So it's definitely kind of one of the more interesting and new techniques being used these days. Tom, what are some other newer techniques that you're seeing utilized more in paleontology these days and in research?
Well, of course, it's not that it's super new, but it's been extremely productive, is CT scanning. And for small organisms, micro CT, because there are just so many details, especially in skulls, that are really hard to get to. And that in traditional style, steel tool paleontology, we just couldn't access. And so things like the endocranium, so the brain cavity, semicircular canals, the passageway of pneumatic chambers, the passageway of neurovascular canals. Those are really important aspects of a living animal. But if you couldn't really visualize them, we can't do a dissection on them in the way we would in a modern animal, but we can do a virtual dissection of them now.
Yeah.
And so that's been extremely helpful.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and then another sort of way of getting to the inside of dinosaurs and other fossil animals is much more old-fashioned, and that's good old-fashioned histology,
Yeah.
thin sectioning bones. And there's a lot we could get from, taking a slice of a bone and polishing it down until it's transparent or translucent and looking at it under a microscope to see the details there. Our real understanding of how we would age a dinosaur, not date a dinosaur, but age a dinosaur, how old it was at the time of death, really ultimately comes from our histological work, our changes, the changes that they went through in terms of bone growth. That's histological. Um, we had a paper. I was on a paper that came out last year, I think it was, where we were looking at these various ligaments in the feet and the arctometatarsi of theropods, and we could see where the Sharpie's fibers, these attachment points, were going into little pits on the inside surfaces of the bone, and it's really a critical sort of technology. Now, I could foresee a future when those two become the same technique, and that will have high enough resolution on a type of CT scan that you could get in there and all see what's going on in terms of the bone histology tissue, as well as the spaces in between the bone. I don't think we're quite there yet, but hopefully we'll get there.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a very good point. A lot of good work has been taking place in that, and people are even, using CT scans and synchrotrons and things to look at histology in a non-destructive way as well. Or sorry, non-consumptive.
Right.
Lynnea, what are some of the cooler technological advances that you've noticed in the field during your time?
I did have first-hand experience with the CT data set. That's what I did for describing the skull. Was I had a micro CT, so then I made 3D models of all of the bones. So that's what I have the most experience with. For me, probably the biggest thing that was new to me was coding, to be honest. There's a lot more use of online or virtual languages like Python and R that I never was expecting to have to learn or use, which it's very, very useful for trying to organize your data and get tests to run fairly easily.
Depends on the person, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. So I wanted to ask the three of you, what do you see that are some outstanding needs in the field? Areas where people could be working more, geographical areas that are in need of more work, or so what's one of the questions that seem to not be being answered that could be worked towards that just isn't as trendy right now? What are some of those concepts or some of those ideas that you see in the field?
Well, in terms of geographic areas, I know of some that we know would be productive, but for various geopolitical reasons and quite frankly, the security of the researchers, people can't get to as much. So there are spots in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan and so forth that in the days of the Soviet Union, there were fossils coming out of there, but now there's a lot of basically gangsters in some of those parts of the world. In fact, there were a number of Western geologists who were taken captive and some of them killed. They weren't paleontologists; they were doing field geology. And we know that there are good Jurassic and Cretaceous sites there, maybe comparable to some of the ones in, say, northeastern China and so forth. But for pragmatic reasons, people can't get to them, at least not right now. But even spots that have long been prospected turn out new bones. So the Laurel, Maryland dinosaur dig, just north of campus where I work, we've had bits and pieces, and then of dinosaurs over the century, and then on Earth Day this year, The JP Hodnett and others working on that site hit a bone bed and a hill, and it's going the right direction into the hill, which is good. So at least 4 different dinosaurian taxa, possibly more, have been found there. So well-populated area, historically long-known site, even those can provide us with surprises.
Absolutely.
My personal plug would have to be Antarctica, but that's really because I'm trying to go there. So if someone's going there and they want to bring me, I'm ready and willing.
You've got the coat. You're ready to go.
Yeah.
I would just ask, Lynnea, do you know if there's like upsection from the Cryolophosaurus bed? Is there any hint of fossils above that? Like maybe in the middle?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's very possible, but it's a lot of ice to get through.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Evan,
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I would like to talk about would be access and outreach in paleontology in more underrepresented countries. So one example that I can think of would have to be Niger, which has a very vast wealth of paleontology and archaeology. And one of the things that Dr. Paul Sereno has been working on is creating a museum program called Niger Heritage that serves more in the outreach and understanding of paleontology and archaeology that is present in Niger, as well as being able to train the next generation of African paleontologists. And I think it would be great if we actually started to provide more outreach to more underrepresented areas, not just in parts of like Africa, but also in India, because we all remember Bruhoff Kaakasaurus. I think that's how you pronounce its name. It's the giant titanosaur, which everyone thought was a giant tree, but after further evidence, it now looks like it's a giant titanosaur, and it's really a shame of what happened to it as well. But it would be great if we actually did advocate more outreach for paleontology, because everyone has a rich diversity and history in fossils.
Absolutely. And we have to think about accessibility to outcrops. Not everyone has the same ability to travel or to go out and hike or do some of the physical demands of field work. And how can we still make paleontology open to everybody that wants to participate?
Like places like Dinosaur National Monument, just to point that out.
Yes.
Where people could come by and see one of the world's most famous dinosaur quarries, although it's at 75 degrees or whatever.
There's that.
Yeah.
But we do have ropes and we do have the means to get people to the fossils that they need to see. So yeah, we do have opportunities for in situ quarries and places where things are more accessible. We're creating a more 3D realm where people can study these things remotely as well.
Mm.
And this is kind of a loaded question. So I know that in the Mesozoic, the late Cretaceous gets a lot of love and attention, and not unnecessarily so. There are some really cool fossils and a lot of exposure. But what other ages and stages in the Mesozoic do you think are kind of understudied that do have good fossils or good potential for fossils, and why do you think that might be?
Yeah, I think the Middle Jurassic, and especially the first part of the Middle Jurassic, really needs some more intensive study. It really looks like the foundations of the major lineages of the late Jurassic and the Cretaceous all get their start then. And, historically, long history of Middle Jurassic sites from Great Britain. We don't have that much in North America, except like parts of the Sundance and so forth, where we've got footprints and things. But South America has some really great stuff that's coming out. Some are actually late, early Jurassic and early Middle Jurassic. And China has some decent stuff, the so-called Chutosaurus beds. So the more parts of the world that we can start sampling this time, like about 180 million years ago or so, the more we could see where the foundations of the classic dinosaurs came from.
Absolutely. Working in like the Colorado Plateau and some of these rocks, it drives me nuts that we have this really great abundance of tracks and really cool things to see, but we just do not have body fossils.
Mm-hmm.
Lynnea, Evan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I have something I could probably talk about. It would probably have to be the early to mid Cretaceous of North America. One of the things would have to be the impressive faunal turnover. So we have an allosaur and sauropod rich environment, but upon the extinction, we now get tyrannosaurs and also the diverse ornithischian dinosaurs. The middle Cretaceous is usually the one that's very understudied, and we do have a lot of work that's done by Doctors Lindsay Zan and Pete McAfee and some of the mustn't touch it area, where we are able to evaluate the dinosaur diversity that is present there. So it would be best to maybe see what's going on in that area and talk about the impressive faunal turnover now from North America to Asia.
Going off of that, the sauropod hiatus is also in North America, and I forget which order. It's like Cenomanian to something, another one that starts with a C, and I forget which one.
Campanian.
Campanian, that's what it is. Yeah, so there's sauropods just missing for whatever reason. So that's kind of still untouched.
Yeah.
Touched a little bit, but could be touched on some more.
And
Right.
even looking at some of that period of time in North America, then looking outward towards Asia and Europe and trying to figure out what's going on in those areas as well during the same time is an interesting question. And South America, not to short shift them down there as well. There's a lot of interesting work going on all over the globe. One of the questions that we had from the audience is asking about dinosaur research that's taking place in Europe. There's been several papers that have been published in the last few years describing some more of their remains. Sometimes they're a little more fragmentary, but then you think about like this gigantic bone bed that they have in France right now, and kind of in the earlier Cretaceous. What are some of the advances and some of the work that we see taking place in Europe these days?
Well, Spinosaurus. There's been a number of papers where there has been a tendency with European and UK paleontology to sort of scoosh down, not the geologic column, but sort of think, oh, these are all around the same time. So anything that's a baryonychine Spinosaur in Europe is baryonyx. And then you consider that some of these things are like 15 million or 20 million years apart. So reevaluation of them is showing that they're probably separate genera at different moments in European Cretaceous history. So that's some stuff that's come out recently. There's been some good small ornithopods from Europe. And this goes back a way, but the discovery of the pterosaurs. So like an entire branch of the sauropods that we didn't really appreciate, that are not one of the classic neosauropods, either the macronarians or the diplodocoids, but that diverged earlier than the split between those two. And yet now they're popping up in North America, possibly in Asia, other parts of the world. So there are, new discoveries being made in the place where dinosaur paleontology got its start.
And so there is a question: are Torosaurs just part of the Chimaerasaurid lineage? I think is what Colin's asking. There's some discussion going on about that, and also are they coming over, in end Jurassic times? Are they coming over in early Cretaceous times? How often are these things interchanging between the areas? And there has to be kind of a cutoff point as continents are slipping further away from one another. But there is a lot of interest and work going on in whether or not these torosaurs are related to chimaerosaurids and stuff. So that's definitely something interesting. And not to mention all the cool Jurassic stuff that has been found that's in relation to what we get in the Morrison, for instance.
Right.
And we all hope there will be more papers on all of these soon. We love seeing your papers. There was another question that we had from the audience where they were wondering, where do you all see Eoraptor currently standing with the ever-changing, trees that are research that's being done on those?
I think this is a Lynnea question to begin with. So,
I think it depends who you ask, and I don't think I have determined a thought.
Fair enough.
But I think it depends on kind of which data set you're using. So I think I used one that did include Eoraptor as a sauropodomorph. So that's how I have worked with it in the past, although there's definitely an argument that can be made either way.
Excellent. One of the questions we had is what do you all see as some of the more interesting or surprising fossils that are currently being found in the field? Is there anything that was kind of unexpected or a big surprise that's recently been published on, or that you've seen information on that you can share?
Ooh. Are specimens that were mentioned at the mid-Mesozoic meeting fair?
I think they're fair as long as there wasn't a no tweet sign.
Yeah, see, I'm not certain because I wasn't there. So there are some very cool things coming out of the early Cretaceous of China that are greatly reducing a very, very long, what we call ghost lineage, which is when you, if we have the phylogeny, the interrelationships correct, and one group shows up early and the other group shows up late, we infer that the second one that shows up late had a long history, but we're just not seeing it. This happens a lot in all sorts of paleontology. Well, a new fossil from what has been the longest ghost lineage in dinosaurs doesn't get rid of the entire ghost lineage, but it chops a big chunk of it off. And it's a really sweet specimen. So hopefully you'll be hearing about it real soon. I know, total tease, but
it's always nice to know there's still more to come. It's nowhere near being done. Evan, have you seen anything lately that kind of like piques your interest, that makes you really excited?
Yeah, there actually has been some research by Dr. Kerry Woodruff on Pachycephalosaurus. So for the longest time, those are just like the head-butting dinosaurs. But now it turns out they would have basically had a kangaroo-like posture and would have engaged in close quarters combat. So I would be curious to take a look at the cervical and caudal musculature to see like how it could be able to bend and also withstand that much force too.
Excellent. Lynnea, what do you think?
This is kind of related to what Tom was talking about a little while ago, but histology. So I saw a paper that was kind of looking at growth. So it was a combination of histology and ontogeny. So there's a lot of specimens of Musaurus, which is a basal sauropodomorph, and there's many that are at different stages of growth. So there was one study that was trying to see if we can estimate the age based on long bone histology. And it turns out that there was a lot of variation. So body size was not a good indicator of age. And I just thought that was really interesting because it was unexpected to me. And I thought, it would make sense as it gets bigger, it's older, but I guess there was too much intraspecific variation. Or maybe even sexual dimorphism, but I just thought that was a really cool study and unexpected.
Yeah, that is interesting. It could be taken to a lot of different critters that we have large sample sizes to probably as well. So maybe some things could be reevaluated based on that kind of new data. We did have another question about isotopes. We have a lot of friends in paleontology that work in geochemistry, and I know of a study being done currently where somebody is looking, Liam Norris from the University of Texas at Austin is looking at some of our fossils at Dinosaur National Monument and elsewhere in the Morrison, but beyond that, looking at isotope in the teeth to be able to tell, feeding and niche partitioning. Have you all encountered any cool work being done with isotopes or that you're aware
of? Yeah, I mean, sort of the classic sort of studies, of course, are isotopes with regard to feeding ecology, because like they say in biogeochemistry, you are what you eat plus a vital factor. And so, for instance, a paper a few years ago that found, yes, Spinosaurus had more fish in its diet. It was eating more from the freshwater system than its contemporary Carcharodontosaurus, but it wasn't strictly eating aquatic food. that there was evidence of a terrestrial component as well. So that's an example of some of that sort of data. But another thing you could do with isotopes is record the temperature at which bone or eggshell is produced. And there was a paper a few years ago that had a really clever way of using eggshell as a paleobiothermometer of the insides of the mom dinosaurs, where they found that because of course the eggshell is being produced inside the oviduct of the mother dinosaur as the egg is getting shelled as it's leaving the body. They found that the body temperatures of small and medium-sized ornithopods, which they had a record of, and small and medium-sized theropods, were all way too elevated to be consistent with a cold-blooded animal. And even the big sauropods, which could potentially be explained by gigantothermy, so the ability to, the fact that the requirement to retain heat if your insides are much bigger than your outsides, so your surface area to volume is very low. That was consistent with gigantothermy, but it wouldn't require it. So that was a rather nice way of using the isotopes to approach a question that many of us have been interested in, but in a very clever way.
Absolutely. No, that's a very great example. Are there any other questions that we have from the audience? Is there anyone that maybe wants to come off mute and ask a question to our panel real quick? We've got about 5 minutes left before we start to wrap up.
I would like to have Tom's thought on Eoraptor.
Oh, what's my thoughts on Eoraptor? At first, I thought it was a theropod, as many people did. And then when I first ran it through my phylogenetic analyses, and granted, these were back in the 90s, I actually had it come out outside of Dinosauria, at least as Dinosauria is technically defined, which a few other people did as well. In more recent years, in fact, it was part of Paul Sereno's work, re-examining those fossils. So Paul Sereno, one of the people who named Eoraptor and was pushing it as a very primitive theropod, part of it was a confusion among the fossils. There's the classic this articulated skeleton of Eoraptor, and then a bunch of other bones that were found in the same region. Those other bones turned out to be what looks to be a very early theropod, Eodromius. And if you just use bones comparable to the holotype of Eoraptor, it comes out as an early representative of Sauropodomorpha, which isn't that strange because other early sauropodomorphs have sort of theropod-like, or at least generic archosaur-like traits, like this little critter Borealestes from South America. Some of its teeth are flesh-eating teeth. It's still early days before they made that big switch over to being omnivores or herbivores.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else who would like to ask?
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah,
sure.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say real quick, if you guys have like a dream dinosaur fossil of what would be the most ideal thing to find as a fun ending towards the end joke or question, let's hear it.
A tyrannosaurid in a lacustrine deposit with very, very, very fine-grained sediment. So we know what's exactly on the outside of them.
Wouldn't that be nice? Lynnea, what's on your wish list?
That's so hard because I feel like the one that I worked on was pretty good. I mean, it was a skull. The skulls are kind of hard to come by when you're dealing with sauropod things. But I guess maybe a better one because that one was a little crushed. So yeah, maybe like a whole. It would have to be a basal sauropodomorph because that's my thing. And maybe a nice complete one, maybe with skin impressions, maybe something in there.
Evan, what would you pick?
A fully complete articulated Spinosaurus.
Yes. Yes.
That would be nice. And you don't want a mummy one either? You don't want any skin impressions?
Skin impressions would be nice. I think if we could probably have skin impressions and also stomach content too, just so we can see what it would have been eating, would have just been eating fish, or would have also been feeding on smaller prey animals too. And if with the skin, we can probably also possibly run a laser analysis just to see what type of color it would have had on its outward body as well.
That's a great point. Yeah. And there's some interesting things going on with skin texture analysis and stuff that's starting to take place. So there could be some cool things still yet to come in that realm. Looks like we had one other question. Somebody was asking Catherine was asking what the thoughts are on the likelihood that some later Jurassic to Cretaceous ornithischians were omnivorous.
Yeah, well, the dentition in pachycephalosaurs, especially sort of some of their premaxillary and anterior maxillary teeth look like they're consistent with omnivory. And so I wouldn't be surprised if some of them had some flesh in the diet. So that's an example.
It's a good example. And we know Dinocaris had some fish bits in its belly. So that's another curious example. Robert, you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
Well, yeah, or maybe also just a thought of maybe something I'd like to maybe see more attention of. I think when we were back when you guys were talking about ornithischians and herbivores getting more attention, I thought maybe one cool thing might be to study maybe their bite force, because I do know the carnivores get all that, and I know this does take me back to when Tom and I talked about the bite force of Triceratops, and I watched your video again the other day about that, and I was thinking about that the other day, and so I thought maybe that might be cool, seeing that I did hear that maybe the trike might have a stronger bite than the Rex, despite being lower on the food chain.
Mm-hmm.
So I wondered if you had any thoughts on maybe the study on bite force in herbivores.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some work so far that's been done on them. For instance, comparing therizinosaurs and prosauropods and some of the early thyreophorans, the early armored dinosaurs. There's a recent paper that's just out on ankylosaur bite forces, or at least ankylosaur bite muscles. I can't remember if they calculated forces on there or not. I can't recall.
They did.
They did. I thought so. That was earlier, like this week, wasn't it?
Yes.
And they found that Panoplosaurids had a strong, if I remember correctly, Panoplosaurus had a stronger bite force than Euoplocephalus, and perhaps by extension, that Panoplosaurids, sort of classic nodosaurids, there's a whole kettle of worms, ankylosaur interrelationships. That Panoplosaurids may have had a stronger bite force than ankylosaurids.
But there's a whole nother field just waiting there for people to jump in and work on more of these things, more of these questions. Lots of questions still to be answered. Do we have any other questions from the audience that we can answer while we have everybody together? Well, if not, it's been so great to have everyone here joining us today. Thank you so much for your time, and to our panelists for their time to answer your questions. We really appreciate it. And we hope that you will stick around for more of this virtual SVP content. And a big round of applause for David Levering and his group for pulling all this together. And we hope that you'll stick around for more of that content. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate it.